I've been told by Executive Director Radu that I can't start until 1:15, and it is just now 1:15. Executive Director Radu, would you please call the roll?
Regent Bailing.
Present.
Regent Bradley. Regent Delgado.
Here.
Regent Evers. Regent Farrell.
Here.
Regent Greeby.
Here.
Regent Hall.
Here.
Regent Harsey.
Here.
Regent Higgins.
Here.
Regent Langness.
Here.
Regent Menedy.
Here.
Regent Milner.
Here.
Regent Mueller.
Here.
Regent Peterson.
Here.
Regent Pruitt.
Here.
Regent Tyler.
Here.
Regent Vasquez.
Here.
Regent Whitburn.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We've already had a good series of committee meetings this morning, and I know we have a busy agenda on tap for this afternoon. So I think we'll get right to it. First, President Cross will lead us in an overview of the 2015 report on UW System Program Revenue Fund Balances. We've all had a few days to review and digest the plentiful information included in this report, which is now in its second year. I know we appreciate the hard work of our institutions who have worked in concert with UW System Administration to develop this report. You will not find a more thorough or transparent financial accounting. In a few minutes, we'll get into the details. Later this afternoon, we'll also hear our once every 3-year update on UW System transfer pathways and transfer credit services. David Ward, Interim Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, will lead us in the overview. So to get things started, I will turn it over to President Cross.
Good afternoon. Thank you. We've been working on this for quite a while, and we're pleased to review this with you. This is the second annual Program Revenue Balances report, and we're hopefully getting better. I apologize for providing you with 200 pages of data.
Just as long as it's not a test.
There are mistakes in there that we will have expected you to have found by the time this is over. But joining me today is Julie Gordon, our Interim Vice President of Finance. We have been working on this, as I said earlier, and trying to find ways to identify and pull out the key points. But we're trying to keep it simple. Overall, we're on track from the trajectory we predicted last year and shared again during the annual budget discussions in July. We recognize that you've had just a short time to look this over, and it's a lot of information. We will do our best to summarize and make it crisp. We're going to examine this report through 3 different lenses: where we were, where we are, and where we are going. For the first time ever, last year, we described our program revenue fund balances in total, by institution, and by fund. This year, again for the first time, the use of fund balances was integrated into our annual budget process, so you would have a comprehensive picture of our finances by institution and by fund. We will continue to reform this process to even more tightly align fund balances and financial planning so that they are seamless and transparent. So let me begin with the total fund balance, and let me pass this out as a summary sheet. There will be extras. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute and go over this sheet so you have a sense of the big picture. And I'll wait till you get it. So first, a quick reminder on what campus fund balances are. The emphasis here is on balances in the plural, not singular. The program revenue balances within the system are not one big pot of money. I think you know that. They're not analogous to the state's rainy day fund in any way. Individual balances are held at each of our institutions for hundreds, if not thousands, of specific reasons. That's 5 unique funds at 15 institutions and statewide extension. Let me repeat that. 5 unique funds at 15 institutions and statewide extension. The 5 different funds are, if you look at this summary sheet that I handed out, the 5 funds are listed there, and I'll go over those in a moment. The tuition and fees fund, the auxiliary fund, the general operations fund, and the fund that I get a kick out of, it's the other fund, as well as the federal indirect fund. Those are the 5 large funds. So let me spend a minute and look at this in the grand total. We know the grand total is misleading, but let's take a look at this. At the top, you see the tuition fund. The tuition fund began the year with a fund balance of $395,398. That was the fund balance at the beginning of the year. We received in revenues $2.39 billion, and we also spent $2.4 million. So we pulled from the fund balances $58 million. I'm trying to show the fund balances drawing down by fund so you can see that, just like you would in your checkbook. You're looking at what you came in, balance brought forward, carry forward. Here it is. Here's what you received in revenues. Here's what you spent. Therefore, you had to pull from the balances. You will notice on the second category, the auxiliary operations fund, and I'll describe these a little bit more. We actually took in more money than we spent. $12 million, 12.9. That money is held in escrow, if I can use that term properly, because there were so many projects delayed, and that money is accumulating, both for projects that were enumerated but did not move forward, and projects that were approved by the board but not enumerated by the legislature. So it's a combination of both of those. More of those this year are awaiting movement. So if you'll set that sheet aside, keep it close by, we'll keep referring to it. I want to go back to the tuition fund balance, the total fund balance, and then I'll start with the tuition fund balance. But overall, what you're looking at here is a constant trend of declining fund balances overall. The change is actually quite significant. We continue to project that program fund balances, which you can see in total and by institution throughout the system in this summary report, decreased by more than 37% since 2013-14. That's in keeping with our projections earlier this year. Thanks to reforms we implemented, we will continue to better forecast balances. We're working on that. Let's continue walking through an update of the 5 funds and their purposes. First, a quick background note. You'll find Regent Policy 21-6, our policy on reporting balances, the board's policy. It's included on pages 8, 9, and 10 of your report. That's the policy. UW institutions are required to submit detailed plans under 2 circumstances. First, institutions with balances exceeding 12% of expenditures in these funds, tuition, auxiliary, general operations, or other unrestricted. 4 of the 5. There are 6 institutions that have balances exceeding the 12% in the relevant funds. Last year, there were 11. Clearly, those fund balances are dropping. If you take a look at the chart on page 7 for more detail, who's required to do what? These fund balances are categorized as either obligated, planned, designated, reserved, or undocumented/discretionary. Commitment level definitions are included on pages 13, 14, and 15 of the report. Again, Vice President Gordon will explain this later in greater detail. Second part of the reporting, institutions with a negative balance, intuition or auxiliary, only those 2 funds, are required to submit a plan detailing how and when the deficit will be eliminated. There are currently 3 institutions required to develop savings plans. So you have a spending plan if you're over 12% in those 4 funds. You have a savings plan that's needed to be written if you have negative fund balances in those 2 funds. I want to return to some important points regarding the 12% threshold in just a moment. Before we get into more detail on what's happening in our specific funds, I want to draw your attention to a PR balance summary sheet, and I've referred to that already. And I want you to keep that just handy as we move back and forth between funds. This is up at the top, looking at the total amount, and that gives you a reference point. So let's start with the tuition fund. If you look at the top of that sheet, the tuition fund balance is down about $58 million. As you can see, revenues, expenditures. And that's an important element, but look at where it's going. We project that will have dropped from 395 in 14 through the 337 you see this year on your sheet, down to 204 by the end of this fiscal year. That is next July 1. That's where we project that to be. It's important to remind ourselves that this fund is used to advance our academic mission. When we use the phrase, well, our budget is $6.2 billion. Of that $6.2 billion, only about $2.5 billion relates to the direct instructional academic portion of our activities. So you will hear us mix those numbers all too often, I think, when we say, well, the state provides less than 15% of our overall funding. But the state actually provides about 40% of our instructional academic money, because that's the fund almost all of the GPR dollars go into, is in this fund. This is the fund that provides for managing volatility in enrollment, funding, and changes in programs as we implement budget reduction. This is the volatile fund. So what's happening here? The total tuition PR balance was $551 back in 2012-13, the year before that. It dropped to $395, down to $337, down to $204 rather, or nearly a 40% drop. However, by the end of this year, we're going to be down to that $204, and that's a 63% drop over that time frame. That is a significant reduction in the tuition fund. That's the fund where instruction and academic dollars reside. A note of caution here. In last year's PR balance report, 3 institutions, Madison, Stout, and Superior, were below the 12% report threshold for tuition balances, and therefore did not need to submit a spending plan. For 2015, there are now 8 institutions, 5 more than previously, that have fallen below the 12% reporting threshold. The increase of 5 campuses is an indicator that these fund balances are, in fact, coming down. But they can't just come down rapidly. They have to come down wisely. we have to be cautious. What should the low water mark be? This is a concern that I've shared before, and we're trying to evaluate. Hopefully, we will come back to the board with some recommended guidelines for what the minimum should be in these accounts, these funds, excuse me. For example, some of these institutions have experienced modest declines. Others have been significant. For example, between fiscal 14 and 15, Eau Claire's tuition fund balance declined more than 40%, from $18.2 million to $10 million. Milwaukee's tuition fund balance was nearly $56 million at the end of fiscal 14 and sits at $34 million at the end of 15, a one-year reduction of almost 40%. 1 year. The amount in the undocumented category for tuition funds declined from $39 million to about $9.5 million, which is a one-year reduction of nearly 76%. Remember that $9.6 million is spread over 15 institutions, and the total accounts for less than 1% of UW System's total instructional costs across all campuses. In July, we estimated the tuition fund balance would be about $204 million at the end of this year, at the end of this fiscal year. This continues to be our projection, which represents a 63% decrease. And that ongoing decrease reflects the use of balances to address the tuition freeze and to bridge the institutions over the cuts they're having to make in order to bring their expense budget into alignment with their revenue budget. Switching to the auxiliary fund, we'll move a bit more quickly through the next four funds, starting with auxiliary operations. It includes funds for residence halls, food service, student unions, bookstores, and student-segregated fee operations such as athletic facilities and student health centers, to name a few. The fund balance for auxiliary operations increased, as you will see in the summary sheet, increased by $12.9 million from fiscal 14 to fiscal 15. It is projected to decrease by the end of this year down to about $181 million. That's assuming that those projects move forward that have been stalled. We could come back next year and say, well, that they didn't move forward, but we're making an assumption that they will, and it looks like some of them are. Important to note that more than 95% of these funds are reported as obligated, planned, or designated, with designated meaning the funding source limits of how the funds can be used are designated. It can only be used for these types of things. We still project this fund to be down to about 181 by the end of the year. Jumping to general operations, third fund on your chart. General operations encompasses a wide range of activities that support the academic mission. For example, here at UW-Madison, that includes the Babcock Dairy, University Press, and the preschool lab. Basically, businesses within the academic operation that, in fact, provide funds for their own space. They lease space from the university. They provide a service, utilities, all of those kinds of, their costs are paid to the university, and they operate as what I would call tubs on their own bottom, businesses within the entity. Between fiscal 14 and fiscal 15, the general operations fund balance decreased about $5.2 million. This balance is expected to further decrease to about $98 million at the end of this year, this fiscal year. Switching to the other unrestricted category, the other category on this fund, this is a category that's interesting. It's a combination of monies and other purposes. I guess that's why they call it other. It would make sense, I guess. But what's in here? The money that's passed through to the state hygiene lab is in here. The money that's passed through to the state veterinary diagnostic lab is in here. The license plate scholarship program monies are in here for just as an example. But perhaps the largest piece of what's in here is debt service money that is to be paid in the next 30 to 60 days because it didn't fall in that year. So it's put into this account. The balance increased from $58 million in fiscal 14 to $65 million in 15. These are largely, if not almost entirely, pass-through funds to other entities or operations. And in some ways, this distorts our overall fund balance. These are just pass-through monies, as is true with several other amounts of money in different funds. The final fund is the Federal Indirect Fund. The Federal Indirect Fund is used for wide-ranging purposes, supporting the staff who help institutions compete for extramural awards, competitive faculty startup packages, equipment, and maintenance, and the acquisition of whatever is needed to support and provide for research. The balance decreased by about $5.8 or $6 million, or about 3.3%. It is projected to decrease by the end of fiscal 16 to around 147 or 148 million, a reduction of more than 12%. At this point, I'll let Vice President Gordon share some additional summary and analysis of the report through the lens of the LAB 5 categories, their commitment level designations. She can also offer some thoughts on the campus plans included in the report. Julie?
Thank you. So as noted, for each of the funds that President Cross just walked through, the detailed spending plans categorize the fund balances into one of 5 categories: obligated, planned, designated, reserved, or undocumented, or discretionary. These commitment level definitions were defined and developed by the Legislative Audit Bureau at the time they did their 2013 review of the UW System's balances. And to review the levels of commitment, you can kind of think of them along the lines on a continuum. The obligated balances are the most committed of those funds. These balances are held for a specific purpose that would make it very difficult to redirect those funds for other purposes. And rescinding those commitments that we have would create a significant risk of legal action, cost, or reputational damage. The balances are documented, and examples would include signed contracts for services, an invoice, signed employment letters from faculty or staff, and debt service schedules. Then moving down that continuum, you would next come across the planned balances, which are less committed than the obligated. They are also held for a documented purpose, but those funds can be more easily redirected. Examples of planned commitments would include a budget document or a signed memorandum for a service that is anticipated but not yet contracted for, a plan to hire faculty or staff but where we have no accepted signed offer or acceptances yet, and renovations or maintenance that are anticipated in the coming year. Designated balances are restricted as to how they're going to be spent based on the original funding source. However, there's not a specific obligation or plan in place at the time. An example of this would be our differential tuition, which is generated and spent in consultation with our students. Reserve balances are amounts held for contingencies, such as unexpected declines in enrollment or an abrupt termination to external funding like grant funding would be an example. To be considered a reserve, UW institutions must document the amount of the reserve, how the funds are to be used, and who can authorize usage of those funds. The undocumented or discretionary funds are not yet obligated, planned, or reserved, but there is also, unlike the designated funds, there is not an external restriction as to how we spend those funds. Appendix 3 of the report that you have provides a summary of how the UW Systems balances are broken down by level of commitment within each fund. As we know from President Cross's presentation, it's important to look at the individual funds. I think the same thing goes here as we look at the commitment levels to also take that on a fund-by-fund basis. For the tuition fund, we see the percentage of funds within the obligated and planned categories has increased, with 77% of the tuition balance in one of these categories at the end of fiscal year 15. Tuition reserves across all the UW institutions has decreased slightly from $53 million to $51 million, and balances within the designated or undocumented categories have declined significantly. Specifically, the designated category has declined about $5 million, or 23%, and as President Cross noted earlier, but I think it's worth repeating, the undocumented tuition balances have decreased from nearly $40 million to less than $10 million, a one-year reduction of more than 75%. Within auxiliary operations, 80% of that balance is reported as either obligated or planned, with an additional 15% being designated or restricted by the funding source. The auxiliary reserves did increase from approximately $500,000 to $7.5 million as institutions carefully considered the level of funds that were needed for our contingencies, and then, very importantly, documented what level was needed and how those funds could be used and authorized for usage in the future. Within general operations and the federal indirect funds, we see very similar trends. You're going to note an increase in the percentage of the balances that is categorized as obligated or planned from one year to this year, and a reduction in the amount in designated and undocumented. As President Cross noted, the other unrestricted fund is a combination of monies, many of which are considered pass-through funds, such as the debt service payments that are coming shortly after into the next fiscal year. And this is, in fact, reflected in the categorizations. Less than 1%, or approximately $650,000 of the other unrestricted fund is within the reserved or undocumented categories. So with that summary of the commitment levels, I'll turn it back to President Cross.
So let me conclude this. Thanks, Julie. It's a quick overview of where different funds have been, where they are now, and where they're going. 4 key takeaways. Number 1, the overall fund balance of the UW system is steadily decreasing. Number 2, tuition fund within the overall fund balances is significantly decreasing. 8 of our UW institutions, number 3, 8 of our UW institutions are now below the 12% reporting threshold. 3 were last year. Number 4, delayed capital projects have caused a temporary increase in our auxiliary fund balances. We still have work left to do, and like all of you, I'm committed to working with the chancellors, legislators, and other stakeholders to ensure that we have the most transparent financial system in the state of Wisconsin and one that can serve as a model nationwide. We are using student and taxpayer dollars as efficiently and as wisely as possible. With that, we'll take your questions.
Regent Whitburn.
A second looking back and then a little more looking forward. In reaction to what you just said, we had a beginning balance of $973 million. Now our end of fiscal 15 balance is $924, down 5%. Right?
Mm-hmm.
A year ago when we put this report together and we looked at obligated, planned, designated, reserves, undocumented, there was some puzzlement about, are these valid? Will they carry the audit process? So, Julie, now 1 year later, as you've looked at the performance of the campuses and the financial people at the campuses going through what they've gone through, how do you respond to the question, have we had integrity on the designation of the respective dollars, obligated, planned, designated, reserves? Have you been happy with what you've seen?
Go ahead.
I'll take the first shot, and then President Cross can
Do
add
you
to
understand
that.
what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying, yes. I think the institutions have put a considerable amount of time into reviewing their processes and their balances to ensure that the categorizations are correct. I think we have, within system administration and working with the institutions, have revised the kind of the supplementary information that goes to the institutions and aids in the categorization process to ensure that those balances are properly categorized. We have had teleconferences with the institutions to address their questions, and as they were going about compiling and looking ahead to the end of the year, we had those in advance. We had a number of back and forth communication with the institutions and getting a good understanding of what level of documentation they had and ensuring those balances were correct. I think there were some changes made to almost all of the campus reports as a result of that review process, but not because I think there was an intent to not have those balances have a high level of integrity. It's just kind of that give and take back and forth with the campuses. But I do think now that we have a process in place that has that integrity that we're looking for. I think the Audit Bureau did review it as part of our last audit that was released, I think, in February of this year. And while I think they noted a few things, there were really not, in my opinion, significant findings that would bring into question how our balances are categorized.
I think a year ago what I said, that together we've got to make sure that the report is bulletproof. So as you ask us to stamp now this next report, is it bulletproof? Is it valid?
I think
you
it's
comfortable?
I'm sorry. I think Regent Whitmer, it's much more bulletproof than it was last year, and next year it'll be even more. And why do I say that? I think understanding the definitions of what goes into each of these categories is becoming clearer and clearer to all of us. So it's easier to say, oh, that shouldn't be in that category. That's not an obligated amount, that's a planned amount. We're going to get better and better. I'm much more comfortable with that this year than I was last. If I could have you turn to Appendix 3 in the package. If you could go to the Appendix 3, which should be, obviously, after pages 200, it's a couple of pages beyond 212, it should be 213, 214. Here's one of the issues that's difficult to your question, Regent Whitmer. If you take a look at the planned category, to me, I'm very comfortable with obligated. That's pretty clearly defined what one must have. It's the planned category that is much more ambiguous, if I can say that. And if you look at the totals at the bottom, last year, $437 million of that of the 973 was planned. This year, about 435, roughly 45% last year, 47% this year. I think if there's any ambiguity in whether or not this is bulletproof, it's in that column. And as we work our way through, what does it mean to be planned? What do we have to have? As we continue to press that issue, that's the column that I think needs greater definition. While we're on this page, I would like to point out one other element here. If you look at the undocumented or discretionary column, last year there was $64 million in that undocumented column system-wide. This year there's $30 million in that. Notice the $11 million in system-wide. Of that $30 million, the system-wide is holding $11 million in an undocumented category. That means that campuses have really pushed, in my mind, pushed is probably the wrong word, clearly articulated, gee, that's no longer undocumented. The drop has been on that side of the spectrum. So we're now, last year we had, if you combine, we used the phrase true reserve last year. We said it's about $175 million. That's that 110 plus 64. Reserves and undocumented. This year that's 145. While we were looking at this category, I wanted to point some of those out.
Final question, Julie. We are now 1 quarter into fiscal 16. Any headlines from what you've seen in performance, in expenditures, in spending across our institutions that might fight with what you have here? Everything year-to-date consistent?
I think the headline as of right now continues to be the anticipated declines that President Cross had in his presentation, down to, within tuition alone, down to a balance of $204 million. We know that those numbers need to be revised at some point. I'm not sure how that will come out. The institutions will be in the process of doing that, but up until now, the institutions and everyone has been working tirelessly, I believe, on dealing with their budget reduction as it is. And so working through those issues on the campuses and seeing how that's going to be accommodated, as well as what happened very late in the fiscal year and was finalized at the beginning of this fiscal year, were funds within system-wide that were provided to the institution. So all of that, I think, is still kind of being felt out, and how that might come into play with the balances going forward. And right now, the best numbers we have are what are being provided to you, and we will work going forward to revise those.
Was that, Regent Whitmer, was that your question? Were you talking about since July, in the first quarter, are there any actions that may have caught our attention? Is that...
Well, I think one of the things that we've been nudging toward is reducing the delay in getting performance to budget numbers in front of us. And I think now, what do we get at 6? Does it come at 6 months? And I think we should. I mean, this is another opportunity to, I guess, to express interest in understanding that, you know, over at the Fiscal Bureau, Bob Lang is now taking questions. Well, we're 1 quarter into fiscal 16. How are we doing? The answer is we're doing fine. That's good. They'll know more at 6 months. But our numbers are really big. And we were, you know, in our last meeting, we saw expenditures versus revenues were off by less than 2 points, and it was $155 million. Right? So it's not small ball.
Right. I don't have the data in front of me, and it's not available, but I think that the challenges that in the first quarter that chancellors are dealing with is getting their arms around how to bridge this, if they have the resources to bridge this. And when I say bridge it, bring their expenses into line with their revenues. I think you're going to continue to see, and that's what we're projecting in that $204 million, a consistent draw from the tuition fund balance.
Other questions? Regent Vasquez.
President Cross, I'd like to bring you back to the tuition fund for a minute, please. Because I think in general, the public is interested in what is the tuition going to be, and that seems to be a word that catches a lot of attention. Could you expand a little bit more in terms of that fund, and how exactly would that affect students, classrooms, and how comfortable are you with the fact that we're going from 395 to 337 to 204, and what does that mean in terms of affecting students, classrooms, the overall operation? And again, tuition seems to be a word that catches people's attention.
If you turn the page on the overall, the grand total of fund balances, if you turn the page, you will see the tuition portion of that, whether it's obligated or planned by campus. And the reason I ask you to do that is the question that question that Regent Vasquez asked me to answer is the $204 million appropriate? That was one of the questions.
Yes.
And if you look at those campuses, some of them have more fund balances than others. You go down that list, what's obligated of that $337 million, what is planned, and if you look at the discretionary portion of that, that's gone from $39 million last year to $9 million this year, just in the tuition fund. My point there is that's the money that's used for a lot of flexibility. Now, that's looking at it at a macro up here. If you break it down by campus, you can look at how many campuses have no money in the undocumented or discretionary portion. And I think to get to your whole point, I don't know where that danger point is, but there are a number of indicators that suggest, given the volatility of this fund and the working capital needed in order to maintain the instructional portion of the organization, I would argue that you probably should be somewhere in the 10% range, and the 204 drops below that.
What else, is there anything that we can do to affect that? Is there anything that...
Well, at this point, the thing we were working on, and I was asked this question by others, the only thing you can really do right away is cut expenses. You don't have the ability to generate additional revenue. Well, you can by increasing enrollment, but really that this kind of a issue requires that we cut expenses, and that's what we're working on.
My concern, though, is that you can only continue to cut, but at some point,
Well
it
said.
just is dangerous to continue that path.
Well said.
Thank you.
Regent Mueller.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Julie and President Cross, for your presentation. I have several questions, actually, and a couple of observations, if I may. My first observation is to follow up on what you said about planned expenditures, because that is the broadest category. And when you look at the reserve amounts, it's almost half of our reserve. And I'm concerned that some planned projects are staying in place too long. And so as time goes on, we should be seeing some movement of projects and proposals out of the planned category into other categories. And so, again, that's just an observation, but something that I hope we can keep an eye on. Secondly, a question about debt service. I'm particularly interested in debt service, as you know. We have general purpose revenue funded debt service that's in a separate appropriation and backed by the full faith and credit of the state. And then we have program revenue debt service funded through our auxiliary funds. And when we approve the operating budget every July, there's an enormous number that we spend very little time on for the auxiliary operating budget. And yet when I looked at this report in detail, a lot of the program revenue debt service is showing up as, in this year, fiscal year 15-16, is showing up in a reserve. And you may say, well, Jan, what difference does it make what pot it comes from? But I do think there's a difference. I think we might be understating our operating budget for 15-16 and overstating what could and should be funded from reserves. I didn't see a lot of consistency there across the campuses. So that's my question, but I'm hoping that in the future, Madam President and colleagues, we would get more information on program revenue debt service by campus without regard to where it's funded from, so that we have a better idea of where, to use your words, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Do you understand?
Yeah, make sure I do understand, because if I understand correctly, I think that's a really good question. What you're saying is that when we present future annual budgets, that include the auxiliary budget. What portion of that budget would be debt service payments, PR debt service payments? Is that what you're saying?
For that year.
For that
the
year,
of
that's
the
right.
operating
Yeah, and I also think you made a comment about, is that masking our actual operating costs, because it looks like it's part of operating costs when it's in that budget. Good point, really good point, because debt service should be separated from that.
All right, thank you.
We'll try to do that, Jen.
In looking at all of the detail, and again, it's an incredible amount of detail, and kudos to everyone who helped put this together, but I was surprised that there was very little information on use of the one-time funds for scholarships for the students themselves. And it occurred to me, I don't know very much about how scholarship money is budgeted here. A lot of it, I think, on the federal side is a pass-through. But with all of the concern about unmet need for our students, I would have expected to see a little bit more of the reserve money being used for one-time, again, it couldn't be continued, but a one-time payment to students who had unmet need in the 15-16 year. Why not? Why did I not see that?
Now I know my role. I think if you look at Appendix 1 in the report, we've been focusing on what is to the left of that thick black bar, which we would call our unrestricted program revenue balances. And a lot of what you're talking about, whether it's coming from endowments or gifts or grants or those kinds of institutional funds that are raised to go towards scholarships and financial aid, would appear to the right of that bar in our restricted funds. So I think that is there. It's just in a different category of funds that the Legislative Audit Bureau, when they conducted their initial audit in 2013, and the Fiscal Bureau as well, as they were largely involved in this, recognized the difference in the fund types and how we can use them.
Fair enough. You can see my point. I did it when you look and see how many uses have been developed for the use of the reserve. Students weren't high on the list.
May I follow?
But I do understand that now. Thank you.
But aren't you asking maybe a different question? Perhaps I'm misunderstanding.
Well, I already confessed that it's not totally clear to me how the student scholarship funds are budgeted.
They are over in the restricted category, and we're looking at the unrestricted, as Julie articulated. But I think you're also asking, why aren't you using some of the reserves in the unrestricted category to do some of that?
Right. To meet the unmet student need for this year, it would be a one-time basis, no guarantee that it could ever be continued. But we see the newspaper accounts all the time about the debt load for our students, and I expected to see more line items, and I didn't.
If you look at, back to Appendix 3, on the reserve category, I'm looking at which would be the tuition funds, Regent Mueller, on the second page of that. The reserve category there shows about $51 million in that tuition of that 337 or 15% is on the reserve category. I think most campuses are trying to figure out, and there are a few of them there that have nothing in their reserves. They're trying to figure out how to bridge through this, because as they make reductions, budget cuts, and so forth, they aren't sure whether they have sufficient money to carry them through obligations that they've already got. So that's one of the reasons they're probably not quick to use that reserve money. But I think you raise a good question.
Just two more, if I may. I noticed, and again, in reading all of the detail, that, and I think it's because of the instructions that we gave the campuses, but oftentimes when you looked at the use of the reserve, I always felt it should be an expenditure. What are you going to spend this money on? But the words reflect revenues. So you would see often differential tuition or special course fees or student SEG fees as a use. And to me, that's a revenue. I think when I looked more carefully at the directions, I think perhaps the schools were asked to respond in that way. And maybe all we're missing is programs funded by differential tuition or programs funded with segregated fees. But that lack of specificity in those instances, troubled me. So I hope that in the future there would be fewer of those kinds of things.
Let me make sure I understand that. On the plans.
On the plans, it would say what sounded like a revenue.
I gotcha.
We can work on that.
And then finally, I promise, as Chair of Business and Finance, I've been thinking a lot about the schools that have money above our 12% reporting threshold and those who have to come up with a savings plan. And to follow up, I think, on one of Regent Whitburn's concerns, I would hope my colleagues would agree perhaps we could have a mid-year report to the Business and Finance Committee, if not to the whole board, from those campuses that are over or under, or any other unusual swings that might happen. I think we'd all feel a bit more comfortable, and I would pursue that with my colleagues in the future.
Okay.
But again, thank you. I hope these data are used by other policymakers. It was a disappointment to me in the budget that all the work and worry that went into putting the discrete categories together wasn't always used. And here we have another year of unbelievably detailed data. And I hope that people take the time to look at it. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
If I could just follow up on Regent Milner's comment about the usage of the reserves for one time. I think there are times when that has to be done, but if it's an issue, especially around students and helping students, and there seems to be a repeated situation with them, that they're, in terms of overall financial aid or financial need, I would hope that we try to have the system try to figure out a longer-term solution than just dipping into reserves on one time, because I think it's and I know you didn't mean this as a Band-Aid. If our students really need financial assistance or other ways of helping them, let's not look to these, hopefully, every other year because we happen to have it, but what's the systemic cause that is being brought to our attention that says we've got to dip into our reserves to help that. So I'm just saying that if there's really an issue here that is needing longer attention for a better solution that's a more, hopefully, a permanent solution, let's also look at that and not just simply, and I know you didn't mean it this way, just simply get the money out of the reserve to take care of this.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well,
Madam Chair, may I just make one more
yes.
comment? On this sheet, Regent Whitburn pointed out that's about a 5% reduction, something to that effect. Next year, that 923 or 924, we project to be 690 million. And I pause there for emphasis. If you were to, just if, you were to look at our overall budget of about 6.2 overall now, remember I'm trying to distinguish. If you were to look at that and say, well, what's appropriate? What is appropriate? And I've been asked that 400 times, probably more. If you think, well, 900 million, roughly 15% of your overall budget, 700 million, you're starting to get down closer to the 10% range overall. What I'm getting at here is that we're rapidly, in this year, and then the second year of the biennium is certainly an uncertain time. We expect some serious drawdown in the second year as well. What that looks like, we don't have any idea right now. But that's getting dangerously close to a precarious position. I just want to point that out.
Oh, can I just follow up on that very quickly? Because I just think it would be useful, President Cross, for you to underscore again the limits on these balances. I was recently at a session at one of our campuses with several state legislators. Very smart, very well informed, people who really understand undergraduate and sort of the higher education sort of situation in the state. And one of our faculty members rose and said, you know, we are compensated well below our peers. What are you going to do about that to enable us to attract and retain good faculty? The answer of the legislature was, that's the university's problem. They're sitting on these balances, they should pay their employees. How would you respond?
Let me get a drink of water. First of all, that's a serious problem. The perception is that we are sitting on a lot of money, and it looks that way when it's aggregated and not dispersed. So the perception is that we do have funding, and obviously it's one-time money, and commitment of compensation is ongoing money. However, it is really probably, it has to be, if not our top priority, one of our top priorities going forward, because the compensation issue just cannot continue to widen the gap internally. Whether we have the funds to do that with this, which I don't agree, because there are, as you hinted at, limits on how I can use this. And first of all, it's only one-time money. And those funds would typically come out of the instructional or academic area. Whether that's the case or not, the understanding that our faculty in particular, but all of our staff, and for the most part, have not received a pay raise other than the 1% pay raise in, 8 years? And I think that that's a growing problem. How we deal with it in the coming budget is critically important. But to your point, and I think that's what you're pressing me to say, is that I really would have difficulty using this money for a compensation adjustment. And that's not clearly understood. It would be a one-time kind of adjustment. Is that?
That's what we call a softball.
And I missed it.
Well, thank you, President Cross, and thank you, Interim Vice President Gordon. Again, thanks to all of the institution's CBOs and staff and others who put so many hours helping to develop this report. This is a comprehensive report. It's involved a lot of work this year. It's involved a lot of work developing it over the last 2.5, 3 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I have a motion to approve Resolution 3, UW System Program Revenue Balances Report?
Second.
Is there any more discussion? All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Next this afternoon, we welcome Interim Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, David Ward, for a presentation on our UW System Student Transfer Pathways. Vice President Ward. Not many people may realize that the transfer students account for approximately 1/3 of all our newly enrolled students in the UW system. I want to repeat that, 1/3. That's equated to more than 14,100 students in the fall of 2014. Now that's pretty remarkable. We have a deep commitment to supporting the journeys and successes of transfer students. We continue to concentrate on how we can strengthen and expand services to these students. And today we will hear an overview of the valuable tools and programs we have developed and integrated throughout the UW system to help with this issue. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much. Well, this afternoon we're going to look at an overview of credit transfer. This looks like this presentation could go on for 2 hours. I promise you it will not. But there are a number of very important items that we want to talk about, particularly about the collaboration between the UW system and the technical colleges, some idea of the breadth of credit transfer and a report to you for the first time on how the Universal Credit Transfer Agreement, which is that agreement between the technical colleges and the UW, how that is going. So we start with this kind of picture, which I think is very appropriate, about credit transfer, and we're going to sort of start with a very defined area of credit transfer. We're going to talk about UW and the technical college system collaboration. Then we're going to pull back and look at the broader picture. And so what you see here, of course, is a map of the technical college systems districts on the right and a map of our campuses on the left. When I talk about this, it's very easy to get inside baseball and use terms that you might wonder, what does that term mean? So let's start out with a few basic terms. Credit equivalency, it indicates how a course at one institution equates to a course or a set of credits at another. That's very easy to say, but the process of getting those equivalencies, again, represents a lot of academic staff and faculty work. UCTA, that was the Universal Credit Transfer Agreement. You might recall there was legislation that mandated the technical college and the university would agree on a slate of 30 general education credits that would freely transfer between the two systems and within those two systems. So that's what UCTA stands for. TIS, T-I-S, the Transfer Information System. That is the database that we maintain that contains all of these equivalencies plus a lot of other data within it. And finally, you'll hear me talking about a wizard. What is a wizard? Think of a wizard like an app on your phone. All right, a wizard is an interface that students can use, that advisors can use. And I would add the word advisors in here, a user interface that allows a student and advisors to access credit equivalency data. Because when you look at this data, you're going to see it is a kind of an 800-pound gorilla. A student might be able to do all this, but might be that an advisor needs to help out. Some dimension to who uses the credit transfer services. Literally all of our constituents or customers use this. New freshmen who might be looking ahead as to what courses they should take, where they apply, and if they're thinking of transfer, how they will transfer. Prospective transfer students, that's a very important group of people, either people that are coming in from outside of the system, into the system, or within the system, the new transfer students themselves, and then continuing students. So every year there are over 300,000 visits to the TIS wizard. So that's if you think of it from a transactional standpoint, that's a huge number of transactions. What are the priorities? Now, whenever I give these presentations, as you know, I always drop back into history. I have to tell stories. So in 1973, right after the system came together, the Regents quickly understood and were concerned about credit transfer. But that credit transfer wasn't with the technical college system. It was within the system because we had just put together a group of institutions from Chapter 37, the old Wisconsin State University, and a group of institutions that were within Chapter 36, the UW campuses, and there were big differences and lots of conflict and friction in just transferring within the UW. That early Regent emphasis on this got everybody together because the Regents basically said, hey, we have to have a transfer policy that is easily used and easily understood. So the first transfer policy was established in 1973. Now it's Regent Policy Document number 1. undergraduate transfer policy. Pre-1973, you can imagine that when a student came to a campus, let's say where I started out at Green Bay, presented a transcript to the university and said, I'm transferring to your institution, what do I get for this transcript? That was a hand labor. That was an individual. We had several people in the back room that took these transcripts, and we had some tables, and where there wasn't an equivalency, this went out to the faculty member to say, okay, this student is coming in with, let's say, physics from Platteville, and they're coming into Green Bay. How does that transfer? So it was a paper-based. It was lengthy. A student might not find out what the credit equivalencies were for 3 or 4 weeks. It lacked uniformity. So the goals of the transfer system, which you can see up there, were to provide students with accurate, accessible credit transfer information and thereby reduce cost of education, so more credits would transfer. Deliver student-centered transfer practices. So we had to begin to think about this not as an internal operation, but it had to be outward-facing so students could use it. You're always dealing with the issue of program integrity and quality. When the accrediting bodies come, just referencing back to the Education Committee, they look at things like transfer and how you handle transfer. And then finally, over time, there have been various statutory requirements that we have to meet. So as you're looking at the transfer system, just as, again, a metric, we had 23,000 transfer applications in 2014-15. We had roughly 10,000 in the fall and another 4,000 in the spring. 19,000 approximately were accepted, and of those 19,000, 14,000 enrolled. So it's a big number, as Regent Milner said. When we finally come to awarding degrees, 1 in 3 of our degrees is given to a student who's a transfer student. By the way, I've told you a number of times, I was a transfer student to Madison back before time began. So as we look at transfer, there are 4 major blocks that we're looking at. I'm going to talk first about the universal credit transfer. Then there's the whole course-based system, and we're going to give you a very brief demo of that. Then there's the UW Associate degree, which is a program that is aimed at getting this general education met upon transfer. And then a huge area which is program-based, where we have a large number of agreements between UW campuses and the technical college. So remember I mentioned the undergraduate credit transfer agreement that required us to have at least 30 credits that transferred between technical colleges and the UW. So at the end of the first year of that agreement, and there have been multiple meetings, groups working on this, largely faculty groups from each side, we come up with 4 subject sets, broad sets of coursework. First one is in communication. The second is in social and behavioral sciences. The third in natural sciences and quantitative reasoning. And the fourth is humanities and the fine arts. Now, you'll see there are ranges there, and the range is 34 to 48 credits. And that's because the credit levels of various courses vary by campus. You could have a 5-credit biology course or a 4-credit biology course, and therefore that's what accounts for the range. But you can look at the major areas: composition, introduction to public speaking. Those are the basic building blocks, your general education for a degree. And then look through the other areas and see the other course subject sets that are there. This was achieved by putting a committee together. I mean, isn't that the solution to all of our problems? We put a committee together, right? But this committee produced something pretty important. So we have a joint standing committee between Technical College System and the UW. This is how it works. They meet, they review equivalency data and validate the transferability of courses. They establish course subject sets, and they renew the agreement, in effect, by reviewing this every year. All of this is then fed into the TIS wizard. The objectives or the measures by which we're looking at transfer is to maximize the number of stable course subject sets, the number of course equivalencies, and the proportion of courses that will satisfy UW breadth requirements. Said a little differently, maximize the number of courses that will satisfy general education requirements. So I think a good deal of progress has been made on this front. At the end of this term, all of this will be embedded in the TIS wizard, which we'll demonstrate in a minute. And it will look like this. So the student in this particular inquiry has asked what the equivalencies are between the Black Hawk Technical College and UW Whitewater. And so each of these areas, which you can see probably a little better on your handout than here, tells the student, all right, this course at Black Hawk transfers to this course at Whitewater. So this will be live at the end of this year, and the student will be able to look at that and plan ahead for transfer to the UW system. You might recall in prior reports I've indicated on transfer student, we're getting an increasing number of our transfer students from the technical college system, so this is really important. So that's the undergraduate transfer agreement. Now we're going to kind of pull back and we're going to look at the course-based equivalencies. I'm using this number for the second time, so I want to make sure that you understand. I said there were 300,000 visits, right, to the TIS wizard. There are 300,000 equivalencies in the data set. Think about that. Every course on every campus is related to every other course on every other campus. So we're now into the very heart of this transfer system, where very specific inquiries can be made about courses and what they are equivalent to. So now we come to the demonstration of the transfer wizard itself. And this is going to be a no-hands operation. I'm not doing anything. It's happening by magic. Actually, my partner over there is taking care of this. So we're going to look at the wizard, and up at the top there are a number of areas. And so we're going to go to the area that talks about transfer tools. And we're going to go down to the credit wizard. This is live. We get into the TIS wizard, and we have a number of different things we can do. But we're going to go down and look at the general education area. And we make choices. What campuses do we want to compare? Well, we want to see what will it be like to go from Milwaukee Area Technical College, so we'll pick that, over to UW-Milwaukee. So we'll pick that. And then we'll go down and we'll say, all right, show us the next choice we're going to make. And it's going to have general subject areas. So we're going to look at general education, and we're going to look at natural sciences. And we're going to get from that, then, all of the equivalencies between what Milwaukee Area Technical College offers and what UW-Milwaukee offers. And so as you're looking at these, for example, we have general biology at MATC. That's that course number 114. Equivalent to UW-Milwaukee course number Biology Science 102, and there's the number of credits that would transfer. So every one of the natural science courses that NCC offers, there's an equivalent for at UW-Milwaukee. So this is, I think, of great assistance to the student. So we can kind of pull back. That's the live demo. That's as much as you're going to get. But you too can look at this. Just have to put TIS wizard in.
And what grade level? What does their grade have to be to get it to come?
Generally, the institution is going to require a passing grade in the course. So you're going to have a C or better to transfer. That's a very good point. So let me just digress for a minute, because you all as regents occasionally come to us with there's a transfer problem, right? You know, Sam's course in such and so didn't transfer to this other university. It can be an issue of what the grade level of the course is. So generally D's and F's don't transfer. It also can be that it actually does transfer, but it doesn't apply to the major that the student wants. So that's the sort of broad parameters that you're going to look at in transfer. All right, we're going to go to the last two parts of this. The first is the UW, I'm going to go back to the UW associate degree. And in this, what this does is it tells a student who completes an associate degree on one of the UW college campuses how that's all going to play out when they transfer to one of the four-year campuses. So earning the associate degree prior to transfer provides students with an advantage, because generally what that does is going to allow them to complete the general education requirements of the campus that they're transferring to. That was always a big hang-up. Student would complete general education at one place, then they would transfer to another institution, UW institution, and find out they had to take additional UW or credits because the general education at the institution to which they were transferring was different. So this allows a student to complete the associate degree and then assure transfer and completion of the general education requirements. And finally, the last piece of this, and this is really big, it's a big part of the transfer system, and that is the program-based part of the system. So this contains what we're doing, if you think about this, we're moving beyond general ed, which was the basis for that undergraduate credit transfer agreement. Then we went to course, which gets us to general ed and then to majors. This gets us to the program level. And what this allows you to look at is those agreements between the technical college system and the UW on a program-by-program basis, so that we can line this up for a student who's interested, for example, in engineering technology. And they can look at how that might play out. They start in the technical college and move to, say, UW Green Bay or to UW Oshkosh. Maintaining the transfer service system is a significant amount of work. This is a huge database. It needs to be maintained in terms of the integrity of the data within. So there are various collaborative agreements and standing committees that are looking at this. Basically, the institutions provide the faculty and staff to review courses, to identify and pursue transfer agreements, and to advise incoming and current students. And again, I emphasize the importance of the advisor in all of this in helping the student get transferred with the maximum number of credits. At System, we maintain the transfer equivalency database and web resources, which is what you looked at when we did the demonstration. And then we have to be looking forward to look at the technology. and where that's all going. Finally, I want to mention UW Help, which is an important part of UW Extension, because UW Help provides help to students who want to transfer. So if there are questions about transfer, help is there for them. Takeaways from this. The transfer options and tools work, and the technology options will keep growing. The first point at which what you saw in the Transfer Wizard, in its very early stages, first time it went web-based was 1996. It's been revised numerous times since then. The second point is that transfer services save students and parents money and time. The more efficient we make this, the better off the student is in terms of getting to the degree. And then finally, there's a much higher level of cooperation between UW system and WTCS than I've ever seen. That was a major change when I came back to see how far we had come in that period of time. So with that, I will open it to any questions you might have. Regent Tyler.
Probably more of a comment than a question. Just want to express a tremendous amount of appreciation for the work that's been done on this. I know back when I first started with the technical college, this was high on our radar screen. We have a bias against implementing programs within the technical college system that are terminal. So we're always looking for a partner to take the student to the next level. And there are certainly champions amongst the UW system that facilitate that, and we really appreciate that, because part of what we sell is that education is a lifetime endeavor, and we don't want you to stop at graduation with the technical college. We want opportunities to continue. So thank you for the work that's been put into this, and thank you for the institutions that are partnering with the technical colleges, because it's really important.
So that's a very good segue, because I want to recognize Diane Tracer-Rusk. Diane, raise your hand or stand. She is our transfer wizard at System, and it has seen, supervised, and helped build this whole system that you're looking at. So I want to recognize your work.
You had a slide that talked about complete, accurate, and accessible information, and that's very important. I want to compliment you on that. My question is, what are some problems that still exist?
I think that the technology might pose a problem. It's a huge database to get to. And so I think training and making sure advisors and students understand how to use the system, I think that's a barrier. I don't see as many problems, well, I don't see nearly any problems that we used to have on the fighting of courses. Well, we're not going to take that course because that was offered here or there. One of the issues that comes up, and we try to handle that when I meet with the head of the academic affairs for the technical college system, is if there is a change in the course set, so if someone decides they're going to change, let's say, public speaking or composition to a different kind of course, that everybody has to know that, so that we can make the adjustment in the transfer equivalencies. So it's communication probably is another one of those barriers that you need to be constantly monitoring. Those are the two things I've observed so far.
How difficult is the quality alignment between courses?
I don't get into that work. I mean, I'm not down in the trenches. The UCTA, it explained, but for the other portions of transfer credit, how do they do that alignment? Well, it really harkens back, and maybe Diane, you'd come up and make a comment on this if you'd like to, but it really harkens back to that old system of faculties agreeing about the content of a course with another faculty, but you may have a better view of this.
Certainly. When a student presents with a course that hasn't been evaluated, what will happen is a transfer coordinator at one of our institutions will collect information about that course, which usually is comprised of learning outcomes, the building blocks of any course, and of course syllabi, some information about content, and some information about outcomes. We'll provide that to the appropriate department so that they can take that information and then compare it to their own learning outcomes and content, to their curricula, and then determine on two different levels, is there an equivalent course within our catalog for which we can offer credit, and as well, would this satisfy a general education or breadth requirement at our institution? When that is determined, and this is usually for lower level courses with transfer, but it could span beyond that. When this is determined, then that information is entered into the student information system and will make its way to our larger database.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Yes, Regent Mueller.
Thank you. David, in one of your slides, you showed the number of transfer students who were accepted and then enrolled, and we lost about 5,000 in 14-15 alone.
Yep.
Now, I assume some of those are from out of state, people from USC who were thinking about transferring here. What percentage are out of state transfers, and how many were the homegrown Wisconsin students that we lost that were accepted but chose not to enroll?
I don't have that data. We can get that, I think. Can we not, Diane? Or do you have the data?
Yes. Well, I will say that there is a transfer report that colleagues, and if Sue Booth is present, she may be able to tell us more about that, that is published every year that provides actually all of the information about who our transfer students are, what are our classes, what are our classes, cohorts comprised of, if they're coming from out of state, if they're coming from within our own institutions, from technical colleges. And so at the transfer site, wisconsin.edu/transfer, there is actually a link to those transfer reports where you can get the most recent data.
We'll provide that for you.
President Cross.
I was just going to add that when you ask what are the problems, and I thought David would speak to that, I think just awareness that this tool exists. Is that a fair?
Yeah.
We have to proclaim this from the mountaintop. This is a great tool, Diane. You've done a lot to make it work. But we need to have people use it, and that means we have to make them aware of it.
I guess this is looking towards the future. Is there going to be any implementation of professional schools or leadership schools from the military being used for transfer credits here, as far as a system where someone can leave the military and understand that this will transfer, this won't transfer? Now, I understand there's a lot of specialized schools that don't really translate to college courses, but some things, including language or professional skills, those do have equivalent courses. Is there any steps for that in the future?
May I take that?
Sure.
That's a great question. You're speaking of really a transfer of learning, and we often talk about that in the currency of a course or credits. And in the case of military training, that would be military training that happened with the Department of Defense. And there are a set of recommendations through the American Council on Education regarding credit recommendations. And our institutions will regularly use those credit recommendations to determine if there is a course equivalent at their institution, and they keep that information similarly to how they keep other transfer information. It's more of a prior learning assessment, but again, it's a transfer of learning. We are working with a group of states in the Midwest about understanding this better and how we can better capture that information so it's more accessible to students. in a way that is like our transfer information system. So that is certainly an emerging area of work.
Regent Breed?
Do you know, typically, do we have a net influx or outflux of transfer students into or out of the system, setting aside people who are transferring within the system?
This is where it would be wonderful to have our data people right here telling us. What I can tell you is that when we look at those coming into our system, I did find the data that Regent Mueller had asked about. About 28% come from out of state into our institutions. And I am not exactly sure. There is some National Student Clearinghouse data that can lend to where our students may be going. And I remember some cohort data looking at some very large numbers that did look at student cohorts that did transfer out of state. And it I think, was somewhat perhaps balanced. But that could be data that we could actually easily access and provide to you so that you can have a better glimpse of what the National Student Clearinghouse data is telling us.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ward, and thank you very much, Diane. We're going to move into closed session now, and I call upon Vice President Bailey to present the resolution to move into closed session.